All right, hello. My name is Dan House. I'm the product marketing manager here at Outmatch. It's my pleasure to be serving as your moderator during this hour. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and Twitter. And don't forget to join Outmatch on Twitter at OutmatchHCM. Tweet your questions, thoughts, or quotes while you're listening by using the hashtag OutmatchInsights. Briefly, before we begin, I'd like to give a quick overview on how we'll spend our time together today. The feature presentation will take roughly around 45 minutes, and following that, we'll have some time to set aside a question and answer session with our presenters. If you'd like a copy of today's slides, please email your request to info@outmatch.com. If you look at your GoToWebinar status window or queue, you'll see a questions queue there that you can open so you can interact with us during the presentation, ask questions, make comments, share best practices at any point during the webcast. We'll answer questions at the end during the Q&A session, but anything else we can maybe throw in there during if you have a comment. You can also tweet your questions or comments to @OutmatchHCM with the hashtag OutmatchInsights. If you forget what that hashtag is, it will be at the bottom right of every slide. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's featured speakers, Courtney here and Nikki Cunningham. Both are senior talent solution experts here at Outmatch, and they are with us today because they eat, drink, and sleep industrial organizational psychology. With over a decade of experience in helping companies match the right people with the right roles, Nikki and Courtney are an excellent resource to learn from as they discuss today's topic, which of course is turnover. So, I am going to send over controls to you, Courtney, and you can take it away.
Great, thanks, Dan. Got it. Great. Okay. Well, thanks again for the intro, Dan. As you mentioned, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're great.
Okay, perfect. So as Dan mentioned, my name is Courtney Gear.
And hello, everybody. I'm Nikki Cunningham.
And we are both Senior Talent Solutions experts with Outmatch. We spend a lot of our days, so I know Dan mentioned we eat, drink, and sleep, industrial organizational psychology. But we also spend a lot of our time every day with clients, clients of all sizes and industries, and our goal is really to help them address business problems and identify solutions. How to reduce turnover is probably one of the most common questions we get asked, and we often find that our clients misunderstand how to actually measure turnover, and furthermore, what are the most impactful strategies to actually reduce it. So today we want to share with you many of the lessons we've learned along the way. We're going to start off just kind of shifting your mindset, rethinking turnover and debunking some common myths. Then we want to really define turnover on our terms and explain how to accurately measure it. We'll then walk through some of the common key drivers to turnover and help you understand what you should actually be looking for. And then finally, we will explore strategies to impact retention and discuss some new ways to proactively retain your existing talent. Before we actually get started, I just have a request for everyone. If you can go to the chat queue and share what industry you currently work in, it'll be helpful as Nikki and I kind of talk through the solutions today so that we can share some best practices given your industry. Okay. With that, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so when we think about the impact of turnover, we know a lot of people have fairly negative reactions to turnover. We've heard the stats. We know it has a huge impact on organizations. There's training costs, there's hiring costs, there's costs associated with lost productivity, and there's even an impact on team morale and engagement. In fact, according to a 2015 study by SHRM, employers will actually need to spend the equivalent of 6 to 9 months of an employee's salary in order to find and train their replacement. If you do the math, that actually means for an employee salaried at $60,000 a year will actually cost the company anywhere from $30,000 to $45,000 to hire and train a replacement. The Center for American Progress did another study and noted the cost of losing an employee can cost anywhere from 16% of their salary for hourly employees and up to 213% for unsalaried employees for a highly trained position. I'm sure this isn't surprising or new information to anyone on the call. However, we know how important retention is, yet many companies still don't actually know what to do when it comes to how to reduce it.
Yeah, so today, our goal is really to challenge some of those traditional views of turnover and debunk some of the myths that are out there today. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the fact that turnover is actually not always a bad thing. And low turnover or higher retention is not always good. So again, today our objective is really to help you shift that mindset, your own personal mindset, as well as the mindset within your organization, and then talk a little bit more about how you should be classifying turnover and what you can really do about that unwanted turnover that has a huge impact on your organization. So hopefully today you walk away with some strategies that you can apply, as well as, again, a different mindset or perspective on what turnover really means within your organization. So the first thing that I want to dive a little bit deeper in today is the fact that turnover is not always bad. Well, we know that turnover is expensive, as Courtney talked about earlier. Let's consider the cost of retaining a toxic employee. So I want you all to think about somebody that you worked with that was incredibly unhappy in their role. Perhaps somebody that bullied others or was overly opinionated. Think about that person and the impact that they had on you personally, as well as the impact that they had on the team. According to a study by the Rotterdam School of Management, a single negative employee can cause a 30 to 40% drop in a team's overall performance. That is a huge number. And that damage is not only a contagious attitude, but it manifests in team performance. There's essentially this ripple effect that happens. One negative team member causes others to feel angry or uncomfortable, ultimately impacting the performance and engagement and the bottom line. So as a leader, it can be really difficult to deal with these types of employees because oftentimes they are not necessarily low performers. They can actually be strong performers. But you really have to think about the long-term impact and the broader impact that that toxic employee is having on the team. And furthermore, that individual can seriously hurt your reputation as a leader. Your team needs to feel protected. They need to feel like everybody is being held to the same standard. So when there's somebody on that team that is able to engage in those types of behaviors and not have anything happen just because they're a strong performer, that sends a very specific message to the rest of the team and even the organization. So just another thing to kind of keep in mind as you think about why, it might be good in that circumstance that that person decides to exit the organization. It's not only measured in that emotional impact, but it can cost your company money too. Again, even if that's one of your star top performers, when you start to consider the impact of lost work hours because of people either talking about them or gossiping with them, all of that likely outweighs their contribution and negatively impacts that bottom line. A report that we found as we were preparing, done by Harvard Business School, actually estimated that keeping a toxic worker on the payroll can cost an average of more than $12,000 a year, which is more than double the increased annual productivity that it says a good employee can provide. So certainly, some things to keep in mind as you think about your turnover numbers and what might be, the number of people that are leaving the organization that fall in that toxic category. The other thing to think about is higher retention is not always good. Oftentimes people assume that high retention equals high engagement, and that isn't always the case. Lower turnover can actually be a sign of complacency and lower employee motivation just as easily as it can be a sign of high engagement. And high turnover doesn't necessarily mean low levels of engagement. Some disengaged employees will leave the organization, but not all. We actually found some research that showed 28% of retained employees exhibit lower levels of engagement compared to those who turn over. So meaning more than a quarter of current employees are more disengaged than employees who left voluntarily. On the flip side, zero or low turnover is not necessarily good. If employees aren't leaving, this could be due to a number of market constraints, such as employment opportunities within the region, or could be more organizationally driven. For example, some employees are financially invested in the organization, and they will stay because it's harder for them to leave, and it causes some strain on their finances. Some companies have a negative or weak reputation, so they don't attract recruiters the way that a household name company would. And so finally, some of these employees that are staying in their roles are not necessarily engaged. They're staying because they don't really have any other options. They don't have the skill set to move on to another role. So just some things to kind of think about as you're evaluating your retention and overall engagement. Again, retention doesn't necessarily equal engagement. We know that retention is important. We know it's important for you all to measure it and make an impact on it. A study by Sherm from 2015 showed that turnover is the biggest challenge that HR professionals are facing today, and certainly that message is loud and clear from our clients. However, the traditional form of turnover measurement doesn't encompass all of these factors. And measuring voluntary and involuntary turnover is certainly common practice today, but we think it's important to go a step further and really understand how much unwanted turnover is occurring in your organization. So Courtney is going to talk a little bit more about that and how you can really classify turnover and use that as you build out your retention strategies. Courtney?
Okay, thanks, Nikki. Let's get that. Okay, so let's redefine turnover. So first of all, I want everyone to imagine someone on your team comes to you today and says, I want to talk to you about something. I've decided to leave the company. They then, of course, start telling you their reasons. What's your immediate emotional reaction? Specifically, do you actually feel regret? And have you thought about the impact this is going to have on your business? Your response to these initial questions are actually what's going to help you classify the type of turnover you're experiencing. So depending on your company's retention strategy, you may want to reconsider the way you classify turnover. Oftentimes, companies consider all turnover as equal, but in reality, there's actually different types. Some of our clients have started to classify turnover in 3 big buckets: desirable, okay, and regrettable. Desirable turnover would be perhaps losing a bottom performer or even a toxic employee. And instead of having to actually go through a performance management discussion, they leave on their own. Okay turnover would involve losing an employee in a non-hard-to-fill job with a short learning curve, or perhaps even a contractor in a short-term position that you knew would leave eventually. And then finally, there's regrettable turnover. This would be losing a top performer to a direct competitor, or even a high potential due to lack of development opportunities. While it's important to measure each of these types of turnover and benchmark your turnover to other organizations in your industry, the factors that lead to regrettable turnover are often within a manager's control. So the focus for measurement should really be on how to decrease regrettable turnover. Now, while it's important to separate out the types of turnover, we also want to understand what are some of the root causes of why people are leaving in the first place. So what may actually be pushing them away? Ask yourself the simple question, why is the turnover happening, regardless of the type? Is it an attraction to a new job or experience? Perhaps is it dissatisfaction with their current job? We know some change is good. New employees bring new ideas, but oftentimes there's something deeper going on that you really need to address and perhaps even make changes. Perhaps you have a poorly trained manager that doesn't really cultivate their team, or even a toxic employee that others are afraid of. Whatever the reason is and what's really going on, ask the questions and dig deeper so you understand what's really happening.
And one thing that would be great to get a sense of from you all is how you're defining turnover today. I would love if you could raise your hand or use the raise your hand feature if you have some mechanism to define turnover, regrettable turnover specifically. Is this something that you're doing in your organization today? So we'll give everybody just a minute to respond to that. And again, as Courtney mentioned, this is a good way to think about turnover and potentially look at the way that you're tracking it today and what mechanism you could use to potentially really dig into whether or not it was regrettable or desirable turnover. All right, well, we see a few hands, so that's great to hear that some of you are already looking at turnover this way.
Okay, great. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about some of the potential drivers to regrettable turnover. So there's a few primary drivers when we think about regrettable turnover. So we mentioned the myth earlier that oftentimes our assumption is people leave a job because of pay, which may, as a manager, as a hiring manager, feel like something that really is out of your control and hard for you to influence. However, we actually know through extensive research that salary and benefits are not the primary reason people leave. And in fact, there are many reasons people leave that are actually within your control. So some of those reasons might be job or organizational fit, or perhaps their relationship with their manager. Finally, development opportunities. All of these things can have a significant impact on overall engagement and commitment to stay within the organization. So next, Nikki's going to dig deeper into a few of these areas and help you understand what you can actually do to positively impact these drivers.
Great, thank you, Courtney. So we're really going to spend kind of the bulk of our time or remaining time today to address some of these areas. What are some of the areas that are really within your control, as well as the control of your management team to really make an impact? So we obviously know there are so many factors that really lead to turnover, and to talk about all of those would take us probably a full day. So we really want to target some of those areas that you're going to be able to make an impact. And as Dan mentioned, we're certainly going to leave time at the end, so the last 15 minutes or so, to address any questions that you have, but we'll spend the remaining time talking about some of these areas. So the first thing that we wanted to call out was job and organizational fit, and this is something that we hear through our client base all the time, really leads to, first of all, dissatisfaction in the role. So about 35% of American workers actually quit within the first 6 months, and this is based on research that was done by Quantum Workplace. And you might be asking yourself, why? Why does that happen? And again, many workers have an unrealistic expectation about the job or the workplace, and in some cases, they can be misled during the interview process. So part of these unrealistic expectations are a result of misconceptions among employers about whether or not someone is really a good fit. It's hard for employers to determine whether or not somebody is going to be a good fit for the role. I'm sure many of you use structured interviews, and we do everything we can to be objective in assessing that fit, but it's a challenge, and it's something that of course, at Outmatch we're passionate about, and we're constantly researching to figure out what is the best way to measure that fit. Sometimes in terms of what happens in the process or where that process sometimes falls apart is the fact that we need to hire people quickly. There's a lot of competition out there for your talent, so you have to move quickly and you have to have efficient processes. So sometimes we're in too big of a hurry to hire, and we're just looking for warm bodies to get in the role. And so sometimes we don't give people the realistic job preview that they really need to be able to make a decision to whether or not it's going to be a good fit for the role. Sometimes we have a misconception that anybody can do lower level hourly positions well. You can train people, but certainly we've found through research that isn't the case. There are certain innate factors that are going to lead to success and potentially retention in that role. With regard to expectation setting, again, oftentimes we're just in too big of a hurry. Sometimes we oversell the job or the company for fear that the candidate won't consider the job or the company as they are. The result is that once the candidate joins the organization and is really ingrained in the role, they start to realize that it may not be what they had in mind, and they may not be a strong fit, which often can lead to that turnover that happens during the first 6 months. So, how do we break this cycle? In order to really get people in the door that will have a strong fit for your organization and your culture, the first place that you need to start is defining success and what it means to be successful in your organization. What are those unique factors that lead to success in your company? Once you really understand and clearly define what differentiates those strong performers from bottom performers, and use this information to select people that are likely to succeed and be happy in this role, that's where you really start to see the impact. once you have that foundational information, you can use that information in a variety of different methods throughout your selection process. So I'm sure many of you are using some type of reference checking or personality assessments or, again, structured interviews. It's really important that however you define success, those hiring tools are reflective of what success looks like and accurately measure that information. So in addition to assessing that overall job and organizational fit, these tools, again, also serve as a way to provide that realistic job preview. In certain roles or positions, it may be more critical to give them an opportunity, a real day-in-the-life perspective. For instance, I'm working with a large airline right now on a flight attendant survey, and what we're finding is that flight attendants have a certain expectation about the role. They get into the industry because of the lifestyle that they think the flight attendant position provides them with. But the reality is there's a lot of work that goes into that role, and oftentimes that isn't highlighted as much as it could be. So with them, what we're really focusing in on is how do we actually have them experience what it's like to deal with an extremely disgruntled passenger through a video assessment process. So they're actually having to demonstrate how they would handle this. So again, we're assessing that job fit and whether or not they have the skill set, but also giving them the opportunity to see what it would actually be like day in and day out to deal with the things that they're going to have to. So that's one example of how you can integrate that into your selection or hiring tools. Just ensuring that you have the right people in the right roles is critical and can have a major impact on whether or not they ultimately decide to stay with the organization. We've seen also some major success with Chili's. You can check out, we have a case study on our website, but after they implemented a job fit survey, they've actually seen a reduction in their management turnover by 10%. And hourly, they've seen a reduction by 30%, which translated to $21 million year over year. So obviously, that's a huge number. They've now invested that into their leadership development to really ensure that they have the right managers in place, which brings me to the next area that I really want to highlight here. So the employee-manager relationship, we've all heard the stats about this. One of the major reasons people either stay or leave their jobs is based on their relationship with their boss. We know how important that role is to the overall engagement of the team, and it makes it even more critical to assess your internal management bench strength. So ensuring that you have the right managers in place and then are preparing them to make critical transitions. Transitions are really danger zones, and according to research that we saw by Harvard Business Review, 40% of those high potential promotions fail. And you might be wondering, like, how does that happen? These are high potentials. There are a variety of factors that can lead to that, but one of the major areas and where we see this happening with our clients is that success is incredibly different from one level of management to another. So from that individual contributor role to a management role, that initial transition is a huge one, and it comes with very unique challenges. Then when they move up from managing individual contributors to managing managers, it's a different skill set that is required. So there's these constant shifts in demands and responsibilities, and oftentimes leaders and managers are not prepared to make those transitions. So as you think about your retention strategies, thinking about your management is key. Thinking about their current strengths, their current gaps is absolutely critical. If you haven't read the Leadership Pipeline book, I'm sure many of you are familiar. I definitely recommend checking that out and considering that for your leaders. And that really highlights what those unique challenges are and how you can build your skill set in each one of those areas. So again, although we know there are so many factors that lead to turnover, just remember that your management is critical to that overall retention, especially the regrettable turnover that we're talking about today. So consider the strategies or tools that will really help you determine if you have the right managers in the role, as well as development initiatives to increase their capabilities and prepare them to be effective managers at that next level.
Okay, thanks, Nikki. So while Nikki just touched primarily on manager development and the importance of training managers, I want to now kind of switch gears and talk more about the employee growth and development and how you can positively impact your teams. So one of the primary drivers of regrettable turnover is actually lack of employee development opportunities. According to a 2015 employee engagement report by Tiny Pulse, only 25% of workers feel as though they have ample opportunities for development at their organizations. I'm sure we've all had that employee that left because they didn't see any potential for growth. However, the thing is, you can actually impact this. Oftentimes, things that pull employees away from an organization are out of your control. But when it comes to employee development, this is absolutely within your control. So one of the first things to consider is assessing your current bench strength. So to provide development opportunities, you first need to understand who you have in your current talent pool. By identifying who your high potentials are, who are your solid, consistent performers, and then where you have gaps to fill, understanding what these groups are will help you understand what that bench strength looks like. You then want to communicate to your employees so that they understand how you plan to approach their development. Oftentimes, companies keep their high potential list confidential, but if you never tell the high potential they've been identified, how else are they going to know? Communicating those plans will actually show you're making the investment in their development and that you are thinking long-term, that you have a long-term plan for them to stay with the company. Then when that high potential gets an opportunity outside of the organization, your investment is absolutely going to be a factor they're considering before making a change. In addition to identifying who your strongest performers are, you should also consider a retention strategy for those employees. So not only asking them what they see, where they see themselves going, but also what their goals are. This will tell you a lot about where they see themselves in the next 5 years. Your top performers are often your biggest flight risk, so being proactive in retaining them is going to make a huge difference in terms of retention. In addition to communicating the plan to these employees, you also want to consider how you're going to go about developing them. Tools such as personality surveys with development reports can really help employees understand what their innate tendencies are and the potential they have for future roles. You can then start to formulate a development plan to address any gap areas before they can move up. 360 surveys are another way employees can receive feedback from multiple sources and understand how they are being observed in the workplace. For some organizations, without frequent position turnover, it can be difficult to offer promotion to the next level. So you may be thinking, I want to offer these opportunities to my employees, but I don't really have a position available. Consider the idea of promoting a career lattice instead of a ladder mindset at your organization. So many employees focus on career ladders, which means upward movement in roles, but in reality, lateral or sideways moves in an organization are actually a great way for employees to explore multiple career paths and develop new skills. By identifying stretch assignments, cross-training opportunities, or even management opportunities, these can all be ways to offer development and movement without an official promotion. If you have ambitious employees that desire growth, it's important to recognize that and get creative. Lateral knowledge across an organization can be just as important as a vertical move up. Finally, simulations are another way organizations can give individuals a taste of what's expected in the next role. Simulations are designed to push an individual out of their comfort zone and get a real day-in-the-life understanding of what other roles require. Furthermore, they can help an organization understand where an employee is at in terms of readiness. Perhaps they need another 6 or 12 months of targeted development before they'll be ready, and that's okay. It's just important for you to know those things as a manager. So in summary, we want to touch on a few final things. First of all, remember all turnover is not the same and therefore should not be measured equally. Focus on measuring your regrettable turnover and hold your managers accountable for what they can actually control. By shifting your mindset and that of your organization, you can really start to understand who you're actually losing and whether or not those losses are regrettable ones. If you determine you are losing good people, those regrettable losses, then shift your focus to retention strategies and how to reduce that regrettable turnover by evaluating job fit, providing manager training, and opportunities for employee development. Focus on what success looks like for that role, and then work backwards to put tools in place to identify the right person. Consider training managers so they can adequately develop their teams to strengthen performance. And finally, if you think you already have the right person in the role, assess your bench strength. Then consider what development opportunities you're offering and whether they're enough. Also, don't forget to communicate your plan to employees so they know you're investing in them, and that will further develop a culture of development.
And just to kind of add to that, you know, we do a lot of work with American Airlines. They're one of our biggest clients, and we do a lot on the leadership development side. So I just wanted to add that, you know, with them, what we oftentimes hear from the actual participants, Courtney and I actually do a lot of the coaching, and what we hear from them is, you know, this was such an investment of the company, and that oftentimes is a surprise to them, but a pleasant surprise. And so it's something that we definitely see the impact happening, not necessarily through formal measurement, but we hear about the fact that employees, they feel like they're being invested in. They feel like they're being given opportunities that everyone necessarily isn't, that they don't necessarily have to be. So I definitely think, you know, it's important to remember that although it can be a huge investment to create leadership development and leadership workshops, the impact that we see with our client organizations is huge. It oftentimes takes a while to see in objective data, but we certainly hear it from the participants themselves, and it's a very rewarding part of our role as well. So with that, I think what we would like to do, I know Dan had mentioned to us that there were some questions coming in, so we would love to kind of open the floor to any questions that you may have about turnover or any of the strategies that we talked about today.
So this is Dan again, if anybody had forgotten my voice. Coming from Twitter, I have a couple questions here that look to be promising for everybody. So the first one is, how can you hold managers accountable for turnover? And I'm not sure if you have an answer for this, but if you have any insight, I'll be appreciated by the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, you know, it all does start with how are you defining and measuring turnover. So, you know, what we're seeing with a large hospitality hotel organization that Courtney and I both work with is they do a really great job of discerning what is turnover that is within the control of the manager. So they've made some investments to be able to track that data and really understand, again, what is that turnover that they can influence. There are other things. Depending on where the hotel is located, whether it's seasonal traffic. There are so many other factors that influence. So again, they've invested in figuring out what is that regrettable turnover that's within their control. And based on that, that is a key metric for their managers. It's something that as they're going through a performance review process, as they're having conversations with their operation leadership and HR, it's something that is constantly being discussed and addressed. And as part of that, the manager's also responsible for digging deeper again to figure out why is this turnover really happening, asking those questions. So I think it does come down to, is it something that you can track? Is it something that I know there are some organizations that actually have those numbers up on a board somewhere. So they've done a really great job of ensuring, again, that's part of the way their managers are assessed and the way they're rewarded as well in terms of pay.
Yeah, and to just add to that, I think too it's important to notify those managers at the beginning. Let them know, explain to them what's the difference in regrettable versus desirable versus okay turnover, so that they can really think through, as people are leaving, what is the business impact and is that someone we regret losing? And to Nikki's point, having those metrics front and center for the managers as well as for their leadership is really important.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think it's important the way it's positioned within the organization as well. Oftentimes when managers are held accountable for turnover, they feel like it's unfair because there are all of these other factors. So it may not be the main metric that influences their pay or whether or not they're promoted, but it certainly should be something that they feel like they have ownership over, that they feel like they can influence, and it should really just be part of the culture. Really keeping their team engaged should be the primary role of that manager. So I think, again, it's kind of how you position it to them and, again, how you define it.
Wonderful. And then how can you measure engagement and try to predict turnover if your company doesn't have an engagement survey?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. So when it comes to measuring engagement, I think there's a few things you can look at. So first of all, if we think about turnover, when people are leaving, why are the reasons they're leaving? And then kind of work backwards into engagement. So I think if you look at your existing employees and see, you know, what's their satisfaction with their manager? What's their satisfaction with their job? You know, we know that engaged employees work longer hours. They want to socialize with their coworkers. They're often willing to volunteer and raise their hand for additional work and assignments. So those are some more what we would call qualitative ways of measuring engagement. But you can start to get a feel from an organization what that engagement across the board looks like. So I think that's one piece, is kind of looking at some of the nuances across the organization, how engaged employees are. And then the second part of the question, can you say it again, Dan? I know it was measuring engagement and then something about turnover.
Yeah, yeah. So it was and try to predict turnover if you're lacking that engagement survey.
Yeah. So I think then the piece is looking for kind of the red flags, right? So when it comes to turnover, things you may notice is employees ducking out early. You may see them less likely to volunteer. Maybe the employee that used to come to all the company functions or lunches or what have you kind of stopped showing up. All of those things can kind of be warning signs that they're starting to disengage. And as a manager, you should really be proactive in having a conversation. You know, okay, what's going on? Is something happening? Is there anything I can do as a manager to really re-engage you? What are you looking for? I mean, sometimes it's as simple as having that conversation and understanding, what do you want out of this job? What is it that we're not offering? And then try to meet those needs. Because I think sometimes we kind of beat around the bush and don't necessarily know, okay, how do we have those conversations? What if we can't offer them? But sometimes it's as simple as they just want to know they're doing a good job. They want to know that their manager cares about them. A lot of times it's not necessarily financial rewards that someone's looking for. It has more to do with letting them know, just rewarding them for a good job well done.
Yeah, one thing I would add here too is, you know, we hear all the time that rolling out an annual engagement survey can be a very costly and inefficient process, and so that may not always be an option for your organization. I think what Courtney was talking about, some of more of the informal ways to gather that information, is a great place to start. Another thing that came to mind as you were talking about this is something we actually do in our organization called 15-5, and this is a different system and company, but essentially what we do every week is we fill out a few brief questions, and it goes to our manager, and actually leadership can see this and it rolls up to them, but really it's a quick way to assess. I think the first question is, how are you feeling? In general, how are you feeling this week? What are your key challenges? What's going well? And that's about it. But just getting at those 3 questions, you can start to get a sense of what's the overall engagement. Where might there be some challenges throughout the organization that maybe people don't feel as comfortable talking to their boss directly about, or they don't feel comfortable talking to their CEO about, but they can still have insight into that. So I think if you guys haven't heard of that, we love it. It's a great tool within our organization, so just something to consider. The other thing that I wanted to mention too is really focusing on the early engagement of employees. We have a tool called Impact that we tie to our assessment surveys to automatically send out a survey to candidates that have been hired, so new hire employees, to get just a quick sense of how is the onboarding process? How are you feeling today? Do you feel prepared? And asking their managers, what do you think about this candidate? Do you feel like they were a good initial fit? So just another tool to kind of get at that new hire engagement. So certainly if any of the things that we've talked about today are of interest to you, you can reach out to Dan or anybody at Outmatch, and we're happy to talk more about how we actually implement those in organizations.
That's great. Yeah, I have to say that I do love 15.5. It's a voice to leadership that they get to hear every single week. So it's a good plug there.
Absolutely. Any other questions, Dan?
That looks to be it from our side. If you want to click one more screen over, I can close this thing up for everybody and put about 20 minutes back in everybody's day. There we go. So there's the big thank you screen. So thank you for being here. Feel free to continue the discussion on Twitter with the hashtag OutmatchInsights. If you do have questions, you can always ask into that. We monitor it by the minute. I'd also like to thank Nikki and Courtney. They're excellent resources, like I said. You can also probably find them on LinkedIn. It's been another edition to Outmatch Insights. We've recorded this. It'll be on our YouTube channel, and we have the slide presentation as well. So if you'd like those, just send us an email. And we appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day and spending it with us. And we look forward to seeing you next time, which is January 19th, 2017. Everybody have the next couple weeks that are wonderful, and we'll see you next year.
Thanks, Dan.